Hello and welcome to the Byzantine Scotist. Today I have Kleutgen with me to discuss political philosophy. How are you doing today, Kleutgen?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing well. You got a few viewers in. So my general outline for what I want to discuss today is go into some general principles of political philosophy from a Catholic perspective. And then we're going to go into specifically a discussion of the state and discuss what role the government should be, how it should be structured, and then eventually move from there to maybe more specific topics we could go into. So I wanted to start with the basic principles. So would you agree, Kleutgen, that the common good is the reason that we have politics?
Yeah. I would say the common good is the final end of the polis.
Yeah. Right. And also, I think we would agree in Aristotle's general formulation that the individual is insufficient in themselves to achieve this good. And so we need first the family and then multiple families, and eventually we build up to the city.
Right. Yeah. I'm basically an Aristotelian when it comes to politics. I would agree.
Okay. Yeah. And yeah, I think for the common good, there's a big confusion within a lot of modern liberal politics between the concept of the common good and public goods. So when we talk about politics today, we frequently are talking about public goods when we talk about the common good. So we have multiple goods that people have. So for example, public roads, that everyone uses public roads. And so we call it a common good, but really it's a public good because someone could privately own that road just the same. But we've decided that the government is instead going to own it and it's going to be used by many people for free. And I think that that's not really the common good. The common good is more the general well-being of the people.
Right. I would say also when it comes to the common good, there's an important distinction between kind of aggregative theories of the common good. You have many private goods that you sum up together and you get the common good out of that. And then theories according to which the common good recognizes some distinctively public character of this good held in common by all. So I would say that that like aggregative theories are very popular among kind of like liberal early modern liberal theories of the common good. So I would say that the Aristotelian is committed to the opposed view. There's something distinctively common about the public good.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think we can also see this from, especially a Christian perspective, this really comes into a more full view where it's not so much about, and this is where maybe from a Scotist perspective, I would differ from Thomists a little bit. I would say that the common good has to be rooted in a common love and a common communion of people rather than simply the well-being of each person, their eudaimonia. I'd say that sort of happiness can easily lead to a view of simple aggregated individual goods, which are then aggregated into the common good, and that there has to be something that all people are commonly participating in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, does this have to do with the Scotist's kind of voluntarism, that the will plays the central role in his politics, that it might not for Aquinas' theory of law?
Yeah, I think so, because I remember listening to one discussion of the common good from some Thomists, and they were discussing it in St. Augustine. And I haven't read so much in this in St. Augustine, but their explanation of St. Augustine's view was that the common good of heaven is God as the common object of contemplation. But this strikes me as still fundamentally individualist, where now we have lots of individuals contemplating a common end. And yes, there is a commonness to it, which is more common than simple aggregated public goods. But I think it's still not really taking into account the fact that we have many individuals in heaven then who also must somehow relate among each other. And so I would say this love of as the perfection of the will as the common good.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't really know what to say to that. There's this like interesting like corporate conception of heaven. That is very distinct from the kind of the view that like heaven involves this distinct object of contemplation that you alone could enjoy taken individually. That's an interesting point of view.
Yeah, I think so. And I think this explains the imagery we get of heaven within the New Testament, that it really focuses a lot less on what we talk about in systematic theology with heaven of the time between now and the second coming. It focuses a lot more on this renewed earth after the second coming, in which you have a perfect society, essentially. And I think that this should really be our end. I think politics is us moving towards that perfect society. So I don't think politics is something simply for here and now. I think it's something that will be in the world to come as this perfect society that we will form.
Yeah, I think that a key point here that's very interesting too is like whether there is a prelapsarian political authority.
Yeah,
That's very distinctively Aristotelian. I mean, Aristotle doesn't have this.
Yeah, and St. Thomas does affirm a prelapsarian political authority. Well, it seems actually, interestingly, Scotus does not affirm a prelapsarian political authority. He says that government and property are simply the results of the fall. And I think here I'm probably actually closer to St. Thomas than Scotus, despite the Scotus image now speaking on the screen.
Interesting. I don't know that much about Scotus's political philosophy. I believe Augustine shares that view.
Yeah, he has it. It's only in a short treatise. It's actually not a discussion really of political philosophy. He's trying to resolve the question of whether somebody who steals property is bound to return it. And he argues that this property was divided up after the fall. And it was divided up by basically the elders of the society, that therefore these elders who form the political authority have the right to redistribute it for justice. And so in this situation, they would have the right to return it to the person from which it was taken.
Interesting.
So he sort of has to create a whole political philosophy to solve this very minor issue within ethics.
That does strike me. And 2 points. I don't intend this as a criticism of Scotus.
Yeah.
It does strike me as like distinctively modern. I understand that Augustine also held this view, but like most early modern political thought, both accepts the will rather than the intellect, or the will rather than reason, as the basis of the state, and it accepts a positivist conception of property. I mean, like Grotius holds that view, for example.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So I mean, I'm not one of these people who kind of like blame Scotus for modernity. I'm also not one of these people who thinks that like modern political philosophy is just unambiguously bad.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you on both those areas. I do think there is some interesting similarities between Scotus and some of these early moderns on how government was formed. But I also think that this is really more maybe if you're just trying to stop and have a thought experiment about how government forms, this is sort of the natural way in which you might go. But I think that if we're going to accept the authority of Scripture as a better guide, that we see it did pre-exist the fall, with Adam being set as king over the whole creation.
Interesting, yeah.
And so I think I was working on an article on political philosophy drawing on Scotus, and I think that it's better maybe not to go to this one little short treatise he wrote on politics, which is really sort of abstracted into a treatise on politics because it wasn't intended to be one, and instead go to his principles and build a political philosophy from his principles, which I think actually ends up looking like one much closer to St. Thomas's political philosophy.
Yeah, this is the article that you sent me to take a look at a while ago. Yeah, that was very interesting.
Yeah, and for those who aren't aware what we were talking about, I essentially was arguing for especially the principle of the absolute primacy of Christ as central to political philosophy. So for Scotus, God first wills the end of a thing, drawing on Aristotle here, and he argues that the incarnation as the greatest work of God and that which is closest to God, and specifically closest to God, is the human soul of Christ. He argues this must be willed primarily first within God's intention. And so in the order of execution, then, this must be the final cause of the whole universe. And so he argues the whole universe is ordered towards the incarnation. And he also argues then that even if the fall hadn't happened, the incarnation still would have happened because the whole universe is ordered towards the incarnation. And I think if you draw this into political philosophy, especially bringing in the kingship of Christ as articulated by Pope Pius XI, you end up with political authority as being ordered towards Christ, if that makes sense. Ordered towards the incarnation and ordered towards specifically theological end, even without the fall.
Yeah. Do you think that Aquinas's position on the incarnation and its kind of contingency produces theological problems for his politics?
I
This
do think so, yeah. You should accept then a political philosophy closer to what Scotus ends up articulating in his treatise, where political authority then ends up becoming simply the result of the fall, because everything was sort of perfect before the fall, rather than an emphasis that even without the fall, the world still was growing closer to God. And I like Peter Lightheart's imagery here. We switched from being good children of God to being rebellious children. So in both cases, we were still children, but now we're no longer good children. And so we could say maybe that political authority would not have used violent coercion without the fall. So it would have been a guiding principle rather than something that has to put in punishments for you not following them.
Yeah, I think that's also, that final point that you bring up is also true of Aquinas, that he thinks coercion is incidental to political authority, but it's not the fundamental root of politics. And that's obviously very different than the moderns, right?
Yeah.
Who think of authority primarily in terms of the authorization to coerce.
Yeah. Well, for those commenting in the chat, we will get to your questions eventually. I just want to focus on our conversation right now, so keep asking your questions in the chat. So to respond to what you just said, have you ever read Yves Simon?
No, actually.
Okay, he was a Thomist political philosopher. I think he was heavily trying to reconcile Maritain and De Koninck, because he thought that De Koninck got the right principle of the primacy of the common good, but thought that Maritain's personalism wasn't actually in contradiction to this. And Yves Simon has this great article on authority where he likens authority to a lot more like a sort of like a football coach, for example. I can't remember the exact analogy he used, but I think a football coach is a good example. Where, right, there might be multiple plays that are all good to make. But if we simply when we start the play, if we let every player on the football field decide their own play and attempt at this, they're not going to be coordinated to be able to make the successful play. So even if there might be multiple good options we can pick, we needed a political authority there still to coordinate the various actors. Within some situations, I think we can leave it to a sort of chaotic organization as, like, for example, the market, but I don't think that this can be every type of coordination. I think some coordinations have to have a central role.
Right. So that would seem to be very much consistent with Aquinas's view. I think that I'm trying to look up, there was an article I read some time ago on authority, which I think is relevant here. But I think that a lot of modern philosophy is kind of like progressively emancipating itself from this view that politics, I mean, at least modern German philosophy, that politics is essentially just the authorization to coerce, or authority is the authorization to coerce. Oh, the author I was thinking of is Father Quentin Lauer, who's a commentator on Hegel. He's a 20th century Jesuit. He has an article called Authority in the Contemporary World, where he makes somewhat similar points for prelapsarian political authority, based on the need for coordination, which I believe is one of Aquinas' central arguments to the authority of the state, or for political authority, whether you want to say that the state or some comparable institution. Yeah, I think that you get from, in between Hobbes and Hegel, you get this view that the primary purpose of political authority is not as an answer to the problem of coercion, but as an answer to the problem of coordination, which presupposes a substantive end and content towards which human action is coordinated. For Hobbes, it's very different. You just have this kind of negative conception of purpose of authority.
Yeah, for Hobbes, it's simply to stop fighting. And I think Hobbes is part of a project at the time to reconstruct the whole of philosophy, essentially. But Hobbes doesn't start out with discussing political philosophy. I actually highly recommend everyone at some point read through Hobbes's Leviathan, because it's a fascinating book, even if it's pretty much entirely wrong. And he starts off with discussing classical philosophy and trying to recategorize almost all of classical philosophy. And he's discussing what virtue is, the relationship of the different sciences, and eventually he gets down to political philosophy. And when he starts with political philosophy, then he starts off discussing use and lex and trying to change the meanings of use and lex because he thinks they're confused by the classical tradition.
Yeah, the opening of Hobbes is this elaborate the opening of the Leviathan is this elaborate critique of Aristotle,
Yeah.
Aristotle's metaphysics of nature, and you can see like the sort of implications this has for Hobbes's account and also Spinoza's account of natural law, right? That Hobbes makes use of the term natural law, but ultimately it's unclear for Hobbes whether there are such things as natural laws, because he no longer has a teleological conception of nature, and he thinks that absent revelation, or absent the supposition of a God who issues these, I'm forgetting the term that he uses, but they're like canons of reason, I think, are the terms that he uses for natural law interchangeably.
Mm-hmm.
He says, absent the supposition of a God who commands these canons of reasons, they wouldn't amount to laws, because he has this kind of positivist conception of law in general that kind of falls out of his metaphysics of nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is connected to a general project at the time. You see in, for example, Francis Bacon as well, to remove formal and final causality from the universe and to re-understand what we mean by efficient and material causality.
Right. Which there, plenty of like 20th century Dominicans actually have excellent scholarship. I think Pater Edmund Waldstein, I've spoken to a little bit. I'm assuming you must be familiar.
Yeah.
And he's given me like plenty of recommendations on 20th century Dominican neo-scholastics who've been defending Aristotelian biology, Aristotelian metaphysics against Hobbes and Bacon. And my impression of contemporary philosophy of biology is that you do get a resurgence of people who think this mechanistic conception of organisms, at the very least, is untenable.
Yeah, this is something I've been trying to look into a lot recently, because it seems to me to recapture a Catholic view of the universe, it requires recapturing the sciences from a specifically Catholic perspective, in this classical perspective. And so I do think that we need to somehow bring final and formal causality back in. I've looked a lot more at bringing formal causality back in than final causality. And also, I think a change that happens, it's very important, is the shift from organism to mechanism. Because Aristotle starts with looking at how humans are, for example, that we have specific intentions. And then when he looks at the whole universe, he reasons out from that. So this is how we get final causality in the universe, that the whole universe has intentions as well. And within then the political society has intentions. And all of these are likened to organisms. Versus for Hobbes, everything is a mechanism. So political philosophy is really just a mechanism. The mind is really just a mechanism. And final causality is really just an illusion, even essentially for humans at this point. I see in the chat a lot of people are asking about Occam. And we still get to sort of keep Occam around. We still get final causality with humans and animals in Occam. But we lose final causality with the universe. And by Hobbes, the final causality is gone from everything.
Yeah, this is something... really great book I'd recommend. I'm not the biggest Leo Strauss fan, but in Natural Right and History, which is kind of his most famous book, I think it's in the opening chapter, it's kind of bemoaning the contemporary state of political philosophy. And the problem, he says, is that the moderns have banished final causes from nature, at the very least. Human behavior is unintelligible without teleology, without final causes. So for modern political philosophy, you either have to dispel this as an illusion, which kind of gives rise to all these behavioristic theories of anthropology, or you have to kind of carve out this exception for human beings within the otherwise mechanical realm of nature. And that exception is a kind of it's almost like a miracle that humanity is able to exempt itself from the laws of nature, which are mechanical. And so it becomes this kind of embarrassment for modern moral and political thought. And you think, and Strauss himself never gets around to I mean, he has these like very heterodox interpretations of Aristotle, so he never really gets around to Aristotle to defend metaphysics of nature. But
one thing I saw in one of his writings is he says that this exception actually makes sense because Aristotle was reasoning about humans, while the moderns were reasoning more about the universe, and actually both of them made a mistake reasoning it into the other one. I think this is at the beginning of his book on Hobbes.
Oh, okay. I've never read his book on Hobbes. I just finished Oakeshot's Hobbes and Civil Association. I guess they influence each other on this.
Yeah. And so I don't think that that can be the case, though, because maybe it's just something within the human mind that we always want a theory of everything, an underlying explanation of stuff. And I was recently reading through Hugh of St. Victor, and Hugh of St. Victor is discussing the classical liberal arts. And it can be very confusing to us that one of the 7 liberal arts listed, so 4 of them are mathematical liberal arts, and one of the mathematical liberal arts is music. In music, he says, is the study of, is it multitude, of relative multitude. So math can be divided into multitude and magnitude. Are we studying numbers of things, or are we studying the size of things? And then among multitude, we can then divide that into absolute multitude, so numbers. We just have a set multitude. Or music, which is relative multitude, where we're taking the numbers of notes and comparing them. And we're comparing them both to each other and then over the course of time. But then he goes on to discuss, and here drawing on the ancient theories of music. So, for example, Ptolemy, the famous astronomer, wrote a whole book on music. And they discuss how the soul has musical relations to the body, and the various faculties of the soul have musical relations to each other. And then they go on and discuss how the relations of the heavens have musical relationships to each other. And this even gets brought up into modern theories of the heavens. So Kepler, sort of one of the great modern astronomers, actually one of his arguments for heliocentrism was that you get more accurate musical ratios of the planets that would create better sounds if you arrange it within a heliocentric pattern.
Huh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and so I've just started researching this a little bit, so I'm sort of thinking this through as I'm talking about it. But I think there is something to this fact that their view of organisms is a fundamentally musical one, and so is their view of the universe. I haven't thought about so much how this relates to political philosophy, but it seems to me this view of ratio and music is very central to how they see the structure of the whole cosmos.
Interesting. I wrote a paper, actually. It was one of my last classes when I was doing coursework, and it was on contemporary philosophy of biology. And I remember just comparing the first part of the paper before getting into the question of biology was just, what is a scientific explanation? And there's a recent revival of interest in classical conceptions of scientific explanation. So the kind of consensus view of the 20th century, I think it's called the deductive nomological view, which just kind of takes a scientific explanation to take the form of a syllogism. You have a major premise, a minor premise, and for all A, B, A, therefore B. Deductive nomological view. And an alternative conception is that what scientific explanations are supposed to do is not deduce some conclusion, some consequence from a premise, but instead they somehow manage to unify the phenomena to be explained. This is, one can see how a fully explanatory science or metaphysics of nature would ultimately have some one unifying principle of all things.
Yeah.
And this kind of classical conception that arises maybe with the pre-Socratics, or at least with Plato, and continues into early modernity. It kind of dies out over the course of the 19th century. But there's a lot of recent revived interest in this. You can kind of see these kind of heavenly spheres in kind of musical communication with another.
And I do think this goes back even before the pre-Socratics. So I take a lot of the Greeks seriously when they say they're drawing this from the Egyptians. And I think this is likely the Egyptians probably get it from the time of the flood. So I think a lot of this knowledge probably goes back to far before recorded human history.
Interesting, yeah. There's a lot of 19th century scholarship about the Egyptian and Babylonian roots of Greek science and Greek philosophy.
Yeah, and it seems to arise almost out of nowhere among them. So I think that this is likely just far back in human history. I think possibly this is all stuff developed by humans before the flood, or possibly was already known by Adam at his creation.
Interesting. It strikes me as plausible.
Yeah, and so I was just saying on the music, it is interesting that the best possible theory of everything we seem to have grasped so far is string theory, which essentially goes back to the musical view that we have strings vibrating at various ratios and to create the entire universe. And I find that very interesting. I don't know if there's any truth to string theory. I know they've been unable to put it back into our three-dimensional universe, but I do think that that's interesting.
Yeah, I have to confess, when it comes to modern physics, my eyes kind of glaze over and I don't know what's going on.
That's fair.
But
I mean,
yeah,
I'm no
I believe
expert
in
in
a
this
lot of-
stuff. I'm just taking what I've read from other people on this.
yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. It's just stuff that I don't understand. I don't really have the competence to evaluate it. I
Yeah.
believe in a lot of classical mythologies, and also in Tolkien. What's his? Is it the Silmarillion's his creation myth? I don't remember. But the universe is sung into being. Right? It's kind of the product of music. I think this might play a role in Norse and Anglo-Saxon mythology as well. It's kind of an interesting continuity here.
Yeah, there is.
Parallel.
And I think this shows, and this is taken up by the perennialist school quite a bit, but I do think they're getting to something real, that this is a common human tradition that all comes out of this prehistory.
Right. Have you read Wolfgang Smith?
I just got one of his books. I haven't started reading it yet, but I'd really like to start reading him. I skimmed through his book and I listened to a few things online from him, so I have a general idea of his thoughts.
Yeah, I've not read very much of him. I've heard quite a bit. I just started reading, did a debate on Twitter, the chapter of his book on heliocentrism and geocentrism. And I mean, I'm not competent to evaluate these sorts of questions, but it was interesting to hear what he would say. He's certainly like a very legit credentialist, but he's quite fringe, but he's a very competent, legitimate scientist. So
yeah. And it seems to me he's trying to recapture this metaphysical view. I'm getting a little bit of feedback from your side.
I'll just I'm gonna mute it and I'm just gonna move to a different part of my house.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah. There's within this sort of modern helio or geocentrist movement, there's a big anti-metaphysical push among quite a number of them. So I think, for example, I don't mean to pick a fight with anyone, but I think Sungenis's neo-Tychonic model, I don't actually think it's recapturing a pre-modern view, because it fundamentally misses the reason that geocentrism was important for them, which was this role of the heavenly spheres within the universe. And he sees all these planets as fundamentally the same as the Earth, just moving, unlike Earth, which is stationary. And that was not their primary concern. And I think Wolfgang Schmidt, unlike a lot of them, is actually trying to recapture metaphysics. It seems to me Kepler, for example, who accepts heliocentrism, but is trying to find the musical ratios of the planets to the sun, is actually recapturing a more ancient view than Sungenis, just trying to place the Earth in the center, but accepting everything else, if that makes sense.
Right. I think this is a broader problem with a lot of modern Christian apologetics is like a kind of like disinterest in classical metaphysics and the classical context of early Christianity. So I think early Christianity is basically unintelligible without a background in Platonism of some kind.
Yeah.
And a lot of contemporary, understandably, they're trying to speak to a modern audience, and most people that you want to convert to Christianity or you want to defend some Christian point of view are not going to have this background in classical philosophy, but they'll kind of take bastardized forms of classical arguments. I think that, like, I've noticed this a lot with like presentations of Thomistic arguments to the existence of God, which I think are also deeply dissatisfying because it presents the five ways as just kind of scattershot, five unrelated arguments to the existence of God. Or I think a lot of the fascination with like William Lane Craig and contemporary analytic metaphysics arises out of this. That you want to kind of present these neatly divided cuts of Christian apologetics that can kind of be consumed all on their own to prove some conclusion without kind of understanding the unity of classical metaphysics that really makes them intelligible and compelling.
Yeah, I think so. And to move maybe back to our topic a little bit, I think that this comes into play a lot with politics, that, right? I saw a lot of debate, for example. I was at a Catholic college when COVID started, and I saw a lot of debate among the student population over the common good because they looked into the Catholic catechism, saw the word common good is there, so this must be a Catholic principle. But it's also a Catholic school, so a lot of the population is going to be more conservative, so they're going to want to be anti-COVID stuff. And so as a result, the debate became common good or not, but nobody stopped to define their terms of what the common good is among all these people in this debate. Because even though it's a Catholic school, none of them really had this classical metaphysical mind of what the common good actually meant.
Right. Yeah. There's an account on Twitter who used to go by Nigel Carlsbad. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And he constantly just drags traditionalist Catholics.
Yeah.
Which I'm glad he's on Twitter. I think he's an interesting and entertaining guy, even though he's probably very critical of our perspective on this. But he recently posted an article about medieval conceptions of the common good that were supposed to be critical of kind of modern integralist views. So I'm not sure what to make of it. I downloaded it and have not read the article yet.
Yeah,
it's certainly like a highly ambiguous term, and I think people who criticize integralists for making this very ambiguous, ill-defined term do a lot of work for them. They do.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and some of them I think do go and define the common good. But I think then you see when they actually work out into policies, there can be quite a bit of disagreement. So simply because we all agree that the common good is our end, even if we have the same conception of the common good, it can still be quite a bit of room to actually agree and disagree on policy, I think.
Yeah, I think this is part of kind of separate or adjacent to my interest in Catholic political philosophy. I'm very interested in modern conservative philosophy. So Michael Oakeshott is a big influence on mine. And I think people oftentimes expect philosophy to do too much work, that you can have this kind of abstract theory of the good and expect from this you can somehow churn out concrete political proposals. But it seems to me there's this kind of irreducible moment of judgment, phronesis for Aristotle, where you just need like practical wisdom to see how things fit together. And that can't be a merely theoretical task. That's going to involve a faculty of judgment.
Yeah. And so I focus quite a bit on biblical theology, rather. I think that biblical theology here shows this exact same thing, because we see early on Israel is given the law of Moses. And if you actually go read through the law, and almost nobody does this anymore, but actually read through the law, not comparing it to modern laws or anything, just trying to understand its own internal harmony, you realize these are lots and lots of case laws that aren't going to apply in very many situations. That's one of my favorite, and I think the most clear example of this is with the parapets. That in ancient Israel, they had very little rain, so people would hang out on the roof of their houses as another area to have. And so, of course, they have flat roofs. Now, it can be very dangerous to be on the top of your roof. If you fall over, you can die. So there was a law by Moses that you have to put railings on the side of your roof, so that way somebody doesn't fall over. And actually, if you don't put railings on the side of your roof and somebody falls over, you're not charged with manslaughter. You're charged with intentional murder, because you could have done something to prevent their death, and very easily could have done so, but chose not to do it. Now, it seems to me that this is not going to apply in very many situations directly. But if we have practical wisdom, it applies in lots of situations then, because there's lots of situations where I think texting and driving is a good modern example, right? Somebody who is texting and driving and runs somebody over is clearly not intending to do so, but they easily could have not texted and driven, and so they're still responsible for the results of texting and driving.
Right. Did this might be a silly question, but did the category of manslaughter exist in Mosaic law?
It actually did. They have the city of refuge. So if you unintentionally kill somebody, you would have to run to a city of refuge, where it would essentially be a sort of open air prison thing. So it'd be, you have a city, you had a lot more you could live in. It was basically like a normal city, but you weren't allowed to leave it until either so it'd be one person of the family member of the person you accidentally killed who would be the kinsman avenger, and they would have to chase you to the city of refuge, at which point the Levites would hold a trial when you got to the city of refuge. Now, if you once you were in the city of refuge, if the Levites tried it, decided it was just manslaughter, and you stayed, you could have to stay, if I remember correctly. I might have made a mistake here or there. I'm just pulling this off of memory. That if you then, when the kinsman avenger dies, you can then leave. Or when the high priest dies, then everyone is freed from all the cities of refuge as a type of Christ.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, the kind of symbolic parallel is also interesting to bring up at the end.
Yeah. There's a lot. It's interesting. There's both practical wisdom there and typology weaved into one. And it's interesting that when you have the Mosaic law there, we have in Deuteronomy 17, it says that the king should copy out the entirety of the Pentateuch for himself. And then we have in Psalm 1, this blessed man who meditates in the law of the Lord day and night. That I think that this really needs to be a lot more central to our political philosophy, is that any ruler should really know the Mosaic law very, very well. Because even if that's not going to be implemented in their society, this is the ideal law God gave to one specific society. And so we can use those principles within other societies. St. Thomas says the same thing when he's discussing the 4 types of law. He says that the divine law, the Old Covenant, the judicial law, we aren't bound to it anymore, but it can still be useful wisdom. And I also can compare this in, what was it? 1 Kings, I think chapter 3, might be chapter 4. Solomon prays to God to get the knowledge to discern between good and evil. And we see earlier in Deuteronomy, I think, Deuteronomy 139, that children do not know how to discern between good and evil. So becoming a king, you need a degree of maturity here to be able to discern between good and evil. Because in the next chapter, Solomon is presented then with the case of 2 mothers fighting over a child, who's the real mother. And there's no law in the book of Moses that will tell you what to do. So you have to learn the wisdom of what to do to deal with it in that particular circumstance. And we can then see in Solomon, he ends up writing the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes and all these great wisdom books because he's learned practical reason of how to deal with situations.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a text by, this is not strictly religious, but Henry Sumner Main's Ancient Law. It's a famous 19th century book on ancient jurisprudence. And one of the claims that he makes is the transition from primitive to more sophisticated forms of jurisprudence. And he doesn't think that this is like unambiguously, it's not a triumphalist narrative, but that in early jurisprudence, it's primarily understood in terms of the moral wisdom of the kind of law speaker or the judge, rather than law as this kind of universalistic formula. The moral wisdom of the judge decides on a case-by-case basis, and that establishes precedent. And eventually, you have kind of more universal, general, abstract rules built out of what the commonalities of these precedents, as opposed to a kind of modern rationalist view where you kind of decipher the universal moral law in the abstract, and then you kind of forcibly impose it on the particular cases. Mm-hmm. And Maine thinks that one thing that's been forgotten is the emphasis on prudence and judgment in law.
Yeah.
It's not a formula.
Yeah, I think that prudence is very important because this prudence, this is, I think, shifting over to a little bit of our discussion of the actual structure of the state, which is what we wanted to get to, is that within modern government, it seems to me, you want sort of the benevolent ruler who's going to know everything what to do and organize everything according to that principle. Well, and that people then, whereas we were comparing the relationship of this view of the person with final causality in them as part of this system versus this more mechanistic view, is that within the mechanistic view, we need to figure out the best principle and apply it so it goes everywhere, like you were saying, versus the relationships between people being the primary principle, right? So within, they might say, for example, we'll call it liberal for the term here. The liberal might say, for example, it's very unjust, this view where we have the common judgment of the judge, because let's say, for example, we have a witch trial and he believes in witches and we're good modern people who don't believe witches are real. And so he decides that because he believes in witches, we're going to burn her at the stake for being a witch. And that if we had really had a good central principle, we wouldn't have had this unjust one, right? Because maybe the next woman comes along and is accused of being a witch, but this is the judge's wife. And so, of course, he isn't going to want to accuse his own wife of being a witch, so he lets her off. And so they could easily be seen as this personal view of judgment is actually very, is actually very tyrannical, because even though it seems like it's freeing you from the tyranny of a big government, it's actually putting you in the tyranny of individual people. But I think the problem is that in reality, we are judged by individual people and not by abstract principles. And so the system the liberal wants to create is, first of all, unrealistic. And I think, secondly, it's also undignified, that I think that the dignity, and God could have structured the universe in such a way that we were simply ruled by abstract principles, but he created a system in which people judge other people. And so I think that the personalist account is much more dignified to what human nature is. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I have kind of one low IQ thought, which is that anyone who followed certain recent trials knows that the criminal justice system, even in liberal bureaucratic Western countries, is obviously subject to personal bias and ideological pressure.
Yeah.
So that I think that a lot of this liberal fantasy of a self-interpreting constitution, self-enforcing laws, these are fantasies and ideological abstractions that are used to justify the modern bureaucratic liberal state. But actually obscure the fact that there's more personal and fundamental forces that are underlying these laws. So I think that one part of actual justice, of if not eliminating, we shouldn't try to eliminate the element of personal judgment, but realistically accepting it and disciplining it, it would be setting up institutions and cultures that are, and cultural forces, practices that cultivate the talent for judgment. Cultivate good moral character, which is part of the centrality of virtue in the classical conception of republic, which is lost among many of the moderns. Anyway, it sounded like you want to say something.
Yeah, there's like 3 different topics that came up from my mind from what you had just said. So I'll start off with one, which is the relationship of the virtues. That I think we've forgotten what justice is, because justice is the virtue of giving to each person their due. Remember, there was a discussion on Twitter recently of, does social justice exist? Right. So is whether there's a distinction of social justice from individual justice. Some people want to say, oh, there's social justice. Some people want to say there's only individual justice. But really, justice by its nature is the social virtue. It's the virtue of relationships among people. And Scotus actually distinguishes the cardinal virtues slightly differently from the classical tradition, where he places virtue, fortitude, and temperance within the will, and says that, and places prudence within the intellect. And prudence is really distinct from the other 3 cardinal virtues, because the other 3 cardinal virtues, all the other virtues fall under them. But prudence, he says, is the principle that guides the other 3 cardinal virtues. So in order to properly implement justice, we first have to have prudence within our intellect, so that the intellect can properly present to the will the right option.
Interesting, yeah. This kind of reminds me of classical debates. The Stoics had this radical view of the unity of the virtues, that you either have all the virtue. I'm not saying that this is kind of incompatible with our Aristotelian views, but you either have all the virtues or you have none of them, because each of the virtues kind of balances and perfects the others. But this also has the interesting view that you can't partially or incompletely have the virtues. So you're either a sage, a wise man, or a fool. Which is there's a big question in Stoic philosophy: can virtue be taught? I'm not sure they had really an adequate answer to that. Obviously, the Aristotelian view would be that you acquired the virtues kind of piecemeal through practice.
I do think the Scholastic
prudence or justice kind of regulates or harmonizes the other virtues.
Yeah, I do think that there is some of the element of the Stoics here coming into the Scholastics, but they do seem to think that you have to have all the virtues to have one of them. They're going to influence each other.
Right, but it's not kind of an all or nothing.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
kind of an immediate, like you either are a sage or a fool, right? There's
Yeah.
a path of cultivation where you
Yeah.
can imperfectly have the virtues.
Yeah. The second thought that came to my mind in our discussion there, and what you were saying earlier was, no, it's going to drop out of my mind. I'll go to the third one. I have to come back to the second. The third one I was thinking of was the relationship of law and right within classical philosophy. That right is the object of justice for the Latin use, versus law as the regulating principles, right? So use is something that's ultimately then rooted either in the nature or in law as a result. And so you can have natural right versus, and it can be rooted in, you can have a list of rights. Rights are something that are in particular circumstances depending on it. So, for example, St. Thomas talks a lot about the right of a parent over their child, that a parent has a right over how their child is educated, what religion their child will follow, and so on, because their child is unable to use reason. Versus in modern conceptions of law and right, really coming out of Hobbes, is for Hobbes, you have a natural right to do whatever you want. And so as a result, we're going to have law to restrain that, or everyone's going to be fighting each other. And Locke refines this a little bit, where in Locke, you have a natural right to life, liberty, and property, because this is the natural way you have to preserve yourself. And law is then the principles in which we regulate these rights. And this seems to me to be a major shift.
Yeah, I think that one thing that's certainly present in the scholastic tradition, and also my area of interest is late 18th and then 19th century German philosophy, is that right is an inherently relational idea. That I think this is obscured in English, where we primarily speak of, on the one hand, law and justice, which can be common or abstract, but rights, which are individuated and particular. Whereas in Latin, obviously, you have lex and jus, and then in German, you have recht, where, there's a plurality of rights. We can speak of rechte, like you have property rights and rights to speech or whatever. But fundamentally, right is a social and common phenomenon.
Yeah.
And the plurality of rights are derivative from that more fundamental use. And we can only ultimately understand the plurality rights having presupposed already this background context of social relationships, which is inherently concrete. I believe you and I actually talked a while ago. We were criticizing human rights discourse and abortion debates, and the way modern abortion debates they hinge on the right to bodily autonomy. It's a kind of abstract but particular individual right, and the right to life. And there are ways in which you could speak of either of these truthfully, but it's kind of misleading the way that these are the prioritized vocabulary of the abortion debates, when fundamentally there's this background context of your relationships of mother and child, or citizen and state, or the family. And it's these background contexts, which is the field of kind of right or justice in general.
Yeah.
And the individuated rights can only be determined with this prior structure already in place, the conceptual structure, already in place.
To articulate this a little bit for people who are watching right now, who weren't involved in our earlier discussion of it, what we were essentially trying to get at is, right, when the pro-life movement is trying to convince women not to get abortions, this might genuinely be the best approach in the modern world to actually convince somebody. But the general approach is that you could also just put the child up for adoption, and it's not going to interfere with your career at all. But even if that's maybe the most pastoral way to deal with the situation, philosophically, it's still wrong, right? Because why does a parent have a right over their child? A parent has a right over their child because they have a natural duty to will the good of the child even before their own good. And so when they have then the case of a pregnant woman who wants to get an abortion, the real reason that they can't get an abortion is, yes, that child does have a right to life, but more fundamentally, they have a right to have their well-being willed by the parent. And so the child now has a claim over the parent, right? Just as the parent has a right over the child has a right to be treated well by the parent. And so the parent now has to take care of that child. And so the solution really isn't put the child up for adoption. The solution really is you now have to care for that child before and put that child before your career. So yes, it is going to interfere with your career. Yes, it is probably going to ruin the career aspirations you have, but that doesn't matter because your career aspirations aren't more important than that child now. And that's not because you consented to it. It's not because you had a sexual relation and consented to it. If you were raped, you have the exact same moral obligation, because that moral obligation is not rooted in consent. It's rooted in the natural relationship between you and that child. And it's the same with the father. The father likewise has a responsibility to will the good of the child before it. So if the court can determine who the biological father is, that biological father, I think, not only has a responsibility to provide monetary support for that child, they should have the responsibility to care for that child throughout their entire life, enforced by the state, I would say.
Right. Yeah. I think I completely agree. I think that the abortion debate is a particularly striking instance of this, but you can see this problem more generally with just the way liberals think about rights, and it kind of has this caustic effect on the actual kind of embedded relationships that define what it means to be a human person. So when it comes to rights within the family, liberals tend to think, or duties to the state. Liberals tend to think, this is kind of background framework of liberal theory, is that you have these abstract, universal persons who somehow stand prior to social relations that are given to them. And they get to adjudicate by consent, either yes or no, do they consent to be in a family, to be a member of the state, etc. But I think one insight of both Aristotle, but then also the German idealists whom I study, is the inherently social nature of personality. That personality is not just something that stands prior to these relationships that you have already completed, that you get to then exercise through an act of assent or denial of subsequent relationships. But personality is a phenomenon that emerges from being embedded in a community. You really become a person because, well, you're born of a family, and you're cultivated into a community, and you become a citizen.
And we even see this within the Trinity, that within God, there are three persons. Now, of course, we don't want to fall into a social Trinitarianism here, so we have to be careful when we're speaking of this. But God fundamentally is a relation of three persons, and those three persons exist distinctly because of their subsisting relations between each other. And so then when we get to discussing persons, we're created in God's image, and so we likewise exist through relations with one another.
Yeah, I think that image of the Trinity is very instructive here. I would say, this is not at all disagreeing with what you said. I would say one key difference, it's kind of an obvious difference when you think the implications, it's important, is God is infinite personality and human beings are finite. So it's our finite personality, which means that we are dependent upon one another. We are generated in time. We come to be persons over the course of time through encounters with one another. And through the various social forms that takes. And for God, you don't need the mediation of something other than God for him to already relate to himself. So I'm not enough familiar on Scotus's view of the Trinity, which is an interesting topic. But on this Thomistic view of the Trinity, this is a psychological view. The Trinity are these three moments in God's self-relation, self-knowledge, and contemplation, and self-will or self-love. And in human beings, you have a similar process where you need to know what is other than oneself in order to come to know oneself. But in human beings, there's the mediation of a natural world that you come to know first. For God, you need a natural world because God is an infinite, self-directed personality. Not a personality, obviously, but an infinite, self-directed mind.
Yeah, I think Scotus and Thomas would fully agree here on this aspect of Trinitarian theology. It only gets when you get into sort of the more nuances of it that there's some disagreements.
Okay.
Yeah. There's something else I was going to bring up on this. Going back to a point I wanted to mention earlier, but I had forgotten to, was we were discussing that, right, their judge might make a good or bad judgment, so he needs prudence. I think it's interesting that within the classic jurists, I can bring up here Cicero and Quintillion as two clear examples of this. they're talking about the order, and the purpose of the order is they're being trained to do law. And they say that in order for one to be a good orator, they have to be morally upright. So part of the training of a good orator is teaching them the virtues, because someone could be skillful at words, and we would nowadays say, oh, that person's a good orator, but they're using it badly. But for Cicero and Quintillion, they're not even a good orator. They're maybe a skillful orator, but they're not a good orator, because a good orator has to be morally good, and there is actually a distinction in that.
Interesting. Yeah, this is interesting. In the modern view, it seems that you can have all of the natural virtues, but no moral virtue, right?
Yeah. And so I think the question here then is, right, if somebody's going to be appointed to be a ruler, they need to be a morally good person. Now, unfortunately, we're usually faced nowadays with none of the options being morally upright. And I remember when Trump was running, a lot of people were on the conservative side were critiquing Trump for not being morally upright. And the usual response to this is, oh, well, he has better policy options than anyone else. And I think there was something genuine to that Trump was offering a real alternative to a lot of modern conservatism. But I also think the sort of normie conservative critique of Trump was actually getting at something substantive, that the ruler has to be a morally upright person to be a good ruler. So I think we see this a lot with Trump, where Trump was ultimately unable to get done a lot of what he said he was going to get done because he wasn't morally well-rounded as a person.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that there's a lot of problems with Trump's first term. I'm leaving open whether there'll be second, but
yeah.
Like the fact that he is kind of a moral scoundrel. I agree, and I suspect this is the point that you're making, that when normie conservatives, when Robbie George and other people back in 2016 were talking about how horrified they were by Trump's moral character, a lot of this sounded like pearl clutching, kind of inauthentic outrage.
Yeah.
But they turned out to be right, not for the reasons they said, though, right? The problem isn't that it's some kind of, I mean, you could say this, but the real problem is not that it's a great scandal that this man who has affairs is in the White House, but it's that Trump exercised catastrophically poor judgment.
Yeah.
As president. And that's not unrelated to the fact that he's like an impulsive, vicious man.
Yeah. I remember a former spiritual director I had would really emphasize to me the importance of fasting within the spiritual life. Because if you can resist eating meat 2 days a week, you can then go and try and resist lots of sins, make more prudent judgments. But if you can't 2 days a week say, I'm not going to eat meat, how can you possibly resist anything else then?
Right. I think that this is also important for philosophy as well, that the proper exercise of reason depends upon things other than reason itself. It's not. It doesn't just depend upon this talent for intellectual judgment. It also depends upon skills like humility, or virtues like humility, and like physically disciplining yourself and acquiring good character. Obviously, is important for your exercise of the intellectual virtues as well. If we believe in this kind of unity of the human personality. So yeah, I think that that's important. Things like fasting and spiritual exercises for politics and for philosophy.
Yeah. And then getting back then to this application to the role of government, it seems to me that there's a fundamental tension within modern political philosophy over freedoms. Fundamentally, modern political philosophy on its surface frequently talks about giving people freedom as its primary goal. But there's a tension between the liberals and the communists on this, because the liberals want to point out that freedom is freedom from the government, that if we just get the government out of the way, people will be free. And the response of the communists to this is, well, if you're starving to death in the streets, are you really free? Right? Or if you have to work 80 hours a week in order to provide for yourself and you never have any free time, are you really free? And in both cases, right? And so they'll argue, well, maybe we need a big government, or you'll have the anarcho-communists who want to get rid of both and end up with something incoherent and that makes no sense. That fundamentally, we as people exist in relationships to one another. And so maximizing freedom as an abstract principle removed from any particular situations doesn't actually work. It's not actually describing reality. It's maybe describing a nice political philosophy. But as we were saying, it has to actually have prudence. It actually has to be applicable in the real world.
Yeah, I would think that the failure, to a large degree, the failure of both of these is the exact kind of individualism that we criticized when it came to the abortion debate and other related issues, where they presuppose that you have this already kind of ready-made individual who has desires that are just and completely natural to him, that he wants to realize. And the question is, what makes him unfree? Well, it's either things that get in his way that restrain his choice, or things that get in his way by removing options to choose from. Those can be maybe two different kinds of view. Whereas it seems to me that precisely what it means to be free is to realize our good, through the exercise of our rational powers, and precisely what it means to realize our good requires various means and institutions, right? Like the family, the community, I would say the state, as well as the church. So we have a kind of mediated conception of freedom where freedom involves being concretely embedded in a way of life with institutions and established relationships and practices. And you become free through your participation in these things, which means that freedom is inherently something social, right? This is why the ancients speak of the free city primarily, and then the free man is understood. How? Well, primarily by his participation in the free city, the life of the city.
Yeah, and I think that Scotus offers, an important nuance here, which I think responds to a lot of modern concerns, because there's a lot of modern concerns that a Thomistic view of freedom isn't really freedom in any substantive sense, because it's ultimately just your freedom to choose the good, and if there's just one good, then you're simply moving towards that, right? It's almost gets back to a mechanistic view. And I think Scotus offers an important thing here. I think actually heavily developing off of Aristotle, because Aristotle distinguishes between natural and rational powers, that a natural power always moves towards its end, right? So a rock is always going to fall down. Your stomach is always going to digest food. You don't have control over that. But our will, we seem to have control over. And Aristotle says this is a rational power. A rational power can choose between alternatives. And so the will for Scotus then is the rational power that chooses between alternatives. For Scotus, actually, the intellect isn't rational. The intellect simply is a natural power. It has information. It moves towards its natural end of understanding that information. It's the will that's the rational power to choose between multiple alternatives. And then we can apply this to goods, right? So there might be multiple goods. Like we were saying earlier with Yves Simon, that, right, the football coach can choose multiple different ways to make a good play. One of those plays might not necessarily be better than another, but he chooses between one or the other depending on which one he wills. I don't think this is necessarily arbitrary, but I don't think it's entirely limited to choosing one superior good to another, if that makes sense. There could be a sense of a personal choice there.
Yeah, I'm curious. It seems I'd be willing to accept that freedom involves the exercise of a rational power, which, depending on the circumstances, could choose one among many goods. It doesn't seem like the key to freedom is the plurality of choices, though. Like it seems we're free when we enjoy the Beatific Vision, but we really would only choose one thing once we enjoy the Beatific Vision. We're not free to fall, as it were.
I think within a strictly Platonic conception of heaven, that would be true. But I don't think within the biblical picture of heaven, that's true, right? Because when we have, what do we start out with at the beginning of the garden of, at the beginning of creation? We have a garden, a purely natural situation created by God. But we end with a garden city. So there's both a natural element there of the garden continuing to grow and spreading throughout the entire world now, but also a city. And a city is something constructed by humans. And this partly involves the aesthetic choices of humans of how they'd wish to build a city. And I think that that part is freely up to humans, that I think in the age to come, we will continue through eternity to transform the world in many different goods. I remember someone in a YouTube comments recently on one of Cobain's videos said, the way you're describing heaven, talking about Cobain's description of heaven, he said, the way you're describing heaven kind of sounds like Minecraft on creative mode. I know it's a sort of crude analogy, but I think there actually is some truth to that, that there's many different goods we can create which God delights in and desires us to create, because he's created us as individual free beings. And I do think that the freedom to choose between choices is fundamental to freedom.
So you think that the plurality of available options that you could actualize is a precondition of freedom?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I suspect that might be a difference between a Scotistic and a Thomist.
Yeah, this is one of the main points Scotus emphasizes in his theory of the will, because the words we're getting freedom of the will from, it's usually not the liberum voluntatis that's being discussed in medieval philosophy, but the liberum arbitratis, the freedom of choices. And I think that this is, or it's really the freedom of choice in singular there. But I think this is important, that it's not so much the freedom of the will itself as the freedom of choice. And I think the freedom of choice presupposes that there's multiple choices to choose between.
So what do you think about the freedom of angels, right? So if angels exist kind of atemporally and they have one choice, that's like kind of, as I understand it, that's the Thomistic view.
Yeah.
They have one eternal choice. What's your Scotistic view of angels?
Yeah, within the Franciscan tradition, angels actually do have spiritual matter that composes them. So they actually do have a principle by which they can change. Now, the reason they can't change their eternal choice for or away from God is because they were created already in the Beatific Vision. And if you will away from God in the Beatific Vision, there's nothing else you could possibly be presented with that would change your view. There's nothing that could convince the demons to change their view, but fundamentally they do have the choice. So I think that angels, they're created fully mature, so there's nothing new they have to grow in or anything like that, but I do think that they have freedom of choice still.
Okay, interesting.
I think that the angels can only choose good choices and the demons can only choose bad choices, not because they're limited, but because there's nothing else they would desire to choose.
So you think also the angels are temporal but not spatial? So they can undergo a temporal change.
Yeah, I think they can undergo temporal change. That seems to me to be what Bonaventure is getting at. Scotus accepts this, but doesn't really articulate it all that much except to accept it. Because the main debate between Bonaventure and his followers and St. Thomas and his followers, because they themselves never discussed it between each other, but their followers debated it, was over the principle of individuation. So whether individuation can be done without matter to distinguish the two. But the, let's see. I was trying to remember what I was trying to get at here. Yeah, that within Scotus, then, he has a principle. His principle of individuation is that things naturally have within themselves a principle of individuation, which he calls haikaitos. And so he doesn't need any more matter as a principle of individuation, but he still leaves it around there. And I think we can still then take Bonaventure's arguments for angels needing to be able to change as a principle for angels to have matter.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
I didn't think about the connection between the role of material individuation for Aquinas and then the kind of atemporality of angels, or their inability to change.
I don't know if there's a direct connection there, but I think that Bonaventure's principles here allow that change, and Bonaventure himself gives change as one of the reasons for angels to have spiritual matter.
Yeah, I think you and I may have spoken. I'm just trying recently to get into Bonaventure. I was going to read the Itinerarium. In English, of course, I can't.
That's a great, very introductory work to get it. But he sort of brings together lots of different fields of knowledge in an actual spiritual work that's meant to be a devotional work, but it's one of the really densest philosophical works ever written at the same time.
Yeah, I was going to read that and the reduction of the arts to theology.
Yeah, the reduction of the arts to theology will give you a lot of the theory behind what's going on within within the mind's road to God, that you're getting that principle behind it, which for Bonaventure is that all disciplines lead back to God. So he lists off in the reduction of the arts to theology that you have the sense perception, the mechanical arts, and philosophy. And then among philosophy, he divides it into rational philosophy, which is the trivium, or what we would call language arts today, moral philosophy, and mathematics, and natural philosophy. And he divides natural philosophy into physics, mathematics, and metaphysics. And within political philosophy, he divides this into what he calls monastic political or monastic moral philosophy, which is individual. He just means monastic is on your own. He has economic moral philosophy, which is not economics as we would consider it today, but as the relationship of the family. And then he has political philosophy as his last one. So the political order is within moral philosophy, but just like every other art, it leads back to God. So it ultimately is directed as its end towards theology. It can't be treated on its own without considering theology as its end.
Interesting. Does Bonaventure have any works explicitly treating the topic of political philosophy?
I don't think so, but he seems to have a scattered discussion of society throughout his works. I've seen books on his political philosophy, but I've never picked any of them up to read them.
Okay, interesting. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah. So yeah, I want to get to a discussion. We sort of got a little all over the place. So I want to bring this all together into what we were initially intending to discuss. Like good scholastics, we spent most of our treatise just discussing all the premises. We're now going to discussion of the state, because it seems to me that the modern conception of the state, which whatever political philosophy you accept, unless you're an anarchist, you accept the state as the primary principle. But it seems to me this conceives of a fundamentally unitary theory of law and a modern view of nature in which you have a centralized state ruling over everyone, intending to give perfect justice, rather than a more medieval conception of law as the relationships between individual people. And so we can't have a centralized state then. We instead have a more feudal model of government with decentralized persons that relate to one another in various ways. So as families, as lord and subject, it doesn't have to be a monarchical system. It can be a republican system. I'm not in the camp that thinks you have to have a monarchy. I think a republic can work just as well. And within a republican system, though, you have particular people who are elected to certain offices, and it's those people who act rather than the state that acts as some impersonal principle, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so I'd be curious to hear your articulation. I know you say you're very influenced by Hegel on this, of what exactly the state is.
Yeah, so I think for Hegel, the terms, when he uses Staat, he means, this is a big complicated question of what is the state for the moderns? Is there a unitary modern theory of the state? And I think Hegel is deliberately trying to return, in many ways he is a kind of neo-Aristotelian. He's deliberately trying to return to an Aristotelian social theory. Of course, Aristotle does not use the term state, but in a lot of 19th century translations of Aristotle, when Aristotle speaks of the polis or the political community, they translate it just as state. So I think when Hegel talks about the state, he doesn't mean like a unitary impersonal actor that stands opposed to society. I mean, common early 19th century view that you get with someone like Benjamin Constant, where you have civil society on the one hand, or the private realm of individuals either kind of atomically unrelated or maybe in private relations with one another. And then on the other hand, you have the state, which you might think of as the government, as this kind of administrative apparatus that stands opposed to them. For Hegel, the term state for us would probably more be akin to nation. He thinks that you have these relatively cohesive social wholes that are defined by a way of life, and they have a wholly private sphere, and then civil society, and then an administrative apparatus that stands above them. But that the state is the cohesive unity of all of these three moments. The state does not just refer for Hegel to the government. So nonetheless, a unitary government is essential to Hegel's thought. And I suspect this would be what distinguishes him from medieval theorists.
Yeah.
I think that, but nonetheless, it's important to note that his theory of sovereign authority and his theory of sovereignty is very different from someone like Hobbes, right?
Yeah.
The state just is the government. But for Hegel, so that's part of it. Another point for him, I think, so I lost my train of thought there. The government still is this kind of irreducible role. It does play an irreducible role for Hegel, but he thinks that the state, this cohesive body, social whole, if it is to be free, it must be self-determining for him. So it has to, through the exercise of its collective rational powers, administer over itself and regulate its functions in a way that mirrors the human individual. That for the human individual, you have the soul as the actuality of the body, and the soul is involves the exercise of reason to regulate and control the natural body. It's the hegemonicon, the ruling principle of the body, and the soul of the state for Hegel is the law, which is not just the positive fiat of a particular individual, but is diffused through these organs of administration. So for him, the exercise of self-government, which is a central authority in the state, does play this irreducible and important function. It expresses the rational self-administration of the nation. So that's the Hegelian view, that the state is or the government, the exercise of law through a personal authority is the freedom of the state for him, if that makes sense.
That makes sense, yeah.
And he thinks that due to the character of freedom and the character of law, the state must have personality as well. So it's important that you have a personal subject who actually gives his decree to the law. And for complicated reasons, this ends up being Hegel's justification of constitutional monarchy, hereditary monarchy in particular. He thinks is the fully rational state. But yeah, his idea is the state is the actuality of human freedom, because it's the human being in his natural capacity, as well as some of his rational capacities, is actualized in the social sphere. And the self-determination of this social sphere is the centralized state. So that's his argument. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm trying to think through everything, because we'll have to keep going back, I think, on terms quite a bit and going back and forth, because how terms then actually look practically. Because what I see within the medieval model that I find very fascinating is that there isn't really even a discussion so much of the government as an entity. What you get instead a lot more is discussions of authorities. So you have civil authorities who rule over particular spheres, and you have religious authorities that rule over spiritual matters. And one person could be in multiple different authorities. So, for example, in the Papal States, the highest political and religious authority happens to be vested within the same person. But you have these distinct authorities. And then within the family, you have the authority of the parents, specifically the father, who is the head of the family. And then within the economic order, you get, for example, the guilds, which have authorities within them. So you have distinct authorities that rule over different spheres that are distinct from one another. And this seems to me to be a better way to actually get back to what human nature is, which is this relational being, rather than the modern view that I think ultimately reduces people to a mechanism. I guess my question with Hegel would be, how do we get back to this better view of what a person is without falling into the modern view? And how does Hegel do that?
Sure. So I think I'll give kind of like three different points, and the last one will more fully address the final question you had.
Mm-hmm.
So first, on the distinct authorities in their distinctive spheres, they each have their own realm of solicitude and concern. I would agree that from a Catholic perspective, this is a problem for Hegel. This is why I'm not a strict Hegelian in politics. That church-state relations for Hegel and for Aquinas are going to look radically different, and that's because Hegel's a Protestant. And he doesn't accept a distinctive ecclesiastical authority that is responsible for our supernatural end, that stands separate and, in fact, above the state. For Hegel, these things are ultimately unified, because his inspiration is the maybe romantic unity of the Greek polis that he wants to return to and not replicate, but bring to a distinctive modern setting that fully recognizes human subjective freedom for him. And that unity, he thinks, in the polis, one key part of it is the unity of churches, or the unity of the civic cult and the civic authority. Yeah. So for Hegel, there's a Protestant implication here that doesn't accept a distinctive ecclesial power. I think as Catholics, we have to affirm a distinctive ecclesial power, which we can get into. It's a separate, interesting discussion. But
within the late Scholastic, they're drawing this distinction of looking at what the end of society is. So with, like, for example, Suarez concedes that within pre-Christian pagan society, the religious genuinely was subject to the civil because there was only a natural end that was known about. And so they clearly need a religious. You can know the modern idea that religion can only be known by faith. Now, you can know that there needs to be some sort of religion by reason, but you can't know what that religion is. And so the civil authority has to give people a common religion to unite them. But then once Christianity is revealed, we discover that the civil is ordered towards the spiritual, that there is a greater end of the Beatific Vision. And so as a result, then the state has to be subject to the church because we have to get the orders correct. And if you draw the distinction between perfect and imperfect societies, and I think this is articulated really well by Father Thomas Crean and Alan Phimister in their recent book on integralism, that the perfect society within classical philosophy is that in which every good is contained within, every good you can need is contained within it. And for Aristotle, this is the city, but really it's the church within Christianity, because you can't get the Beatific Vision from the city. The city has to be ordered towards the church in order to have a perfect society.
Right. Yeah. I think you and I had a previous discussion about this when it came to Catholic questions of the scope of the state. Integralists who defend kind of world Catholic empire versus maybe the more common view among Catholic integralists who are more linked into the populist right, who might be more sympathetic to nationalist views. And one of the points I made on that debate is that in a pre-Christian order, there is a unity of church and state, or of that term is anachronistic, obviously, but the unity of the secular and spiritual power in the civic authority, because it's rooted in nature. And the state continues, in some sense, to be rooted in nature. However, it's the ecclesial power which is elevated by its supernatural end, established by or communicated through divine revelation. So it seems like there's a kind of asymmetry between the ecclesial and civil powers here, where the ecclesial power is something distinct from and universal, distinct from the civic, universal in scope. That seems to be a necessary feature of Christian political theology.
Well, my concern there is simply, again, when we go back to this concept of the unitary state, that it seems to me if we have a very decentralized system of a more feudal model, that it can naturally build up into almost a world empire, but it's built from the ground up, where we have families that are unified under local rulers who are then under larger groups and so on, building up from that. Not build up in the liberal sense of we just have chaotic market forces acting, building everything up, but rather that we have relations between persons that build up into a network. And because of Christianity's principle that everyone is your neighbor, even the person far off, but this is ultimately going to build up into this network of everyone.
Yeah, I understand that you're not trying to push a liberal kind of atomistic, methodologically atomistic view that you have these kind of primitive atomic forces, and then you get more complex unities building up out of them. But I think that one key part of Hegel's philosophy, which I would argue, I think you can see in classical political philosophy as well, but I'm not as much an expert in that, is kind of the irreducibly public nature of the state. If we see this in terms of kind of modern rights relations, I might have certain rights as a private individual to property, to contract, to status relations with other people. But there's a distinctive kind of right or authority which is held by a political power. I think that the tendency to assimilate public into private right is a problem from the Hegelian point of view, where someone like Nigel Carlsbad on Twitter, this is kind of his view, and his namesake, not actually that Carlsbad, but Friedrich von Haller, Karl von Haller, he only accepts the legitimacy of private right. So they see all kind of feudal relationships in terms of private property and contract relations. The lord owns the land the same way that a free peasant might own his farm, and the lord just happens to have contractual relationships with peasants who live on his land. I think that's very different than a properly political relationship, where you don't have the lord of the land or the ruler doesn't have a property right over that which he owns. He rather has a distinctively political kind of jurisdiction over it.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah,
think that it's the irreducibly public nature of the state. This has an important consequence, though, because if we think that the public law, and being the kind of final end of human beings qua nature is to live in a state,
mhm.
public law is in fact prior to, logically, the private rights and contract relations that we enjoy in civil society. If that's the case, then the state can't be conceived as just composed out of these private relations. It can't be conceived on the model of property or contract relations. It has to be a kind of prior whole that is
Yeah.
distinctly public and social. And I think that that's an important part of the Hegelian critique of this private law alternative.
I see where you're getting at with that. As my concern would be that we ultimately then end up, even if we're trying to avoid the metaphysical principles of liberalism, that we end up at a liberal view of the state accidentally in the end, or we end up in a totalitarian state in which every good is subsumed by the state. And it seems to me this is sort of the liberal critique of integralism, is that you end up in totalitarianism in which there's no more individual goods at all because all goods are ordered towards the good of the state. And it seems to me we also have to avoid that concern of absolutism in totalitarianism. And it seems to me the best way to avoid that is the classical view of rights, which I think presupposes a much more decentralized view of the government. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but
yeah, I mean, I'm sure that many of my friends, I hang out with a lot of conservative legal movement types, and they all think I'm some kind of lunatic totalitarian.
yeah,
I think part of this is in the same way that the good and the freedom of the private individual cannot be really articulated without already presupposing these concrete relationships in which that individual is embedded, right? What does it mean for you to be free and to achieve your good? Well, we can't know that unless we know the relationships in which you're embedded, the kind of duties that you enjoy and rights that you enjoy as a person who's in these relationships, the kind of practices you're involved in, etc. What it means for what the good of the state means, I think, also cannot be specified without presupposing as content civil society, the relationships that are subordinate to the state. That properly speaking, yes, all of our private goods are ordered to the common good of the state, but the common good of the state is not something kind of separate, kind of, raison d'etat, how do you say it in French, reasons of state, this kind of cynical, realist view. It's not as though we can articulate those as something that stand apart from the goods of civil society. So I think there's this kind of necessary reciprocity between the private and the public goods, where they both kind of mutually enrich each other with content, but they can't be specified apart from one another. So I think Hegel's state, and this is a big part of Hegel in the philosophy of right and the phenomenology of spirit, when he's critiquing Rousseau and critiquing the French Revolution. Rousseau does have this view that Hobbes actually shares for different reasons, that the state as an absolute sovereign needs to kind of crush these private associations because they risk becoming factions that could threaten the unity of the state. So for them, you get this kind of like absolutely simple unity of the state that has like no internal content. Whereas Hegel thinks that that's the problem of the French Revolution. The French Revolution kind of tries to sweep aside all of these subsidiary organizations. Where for Hegel, it's not that these subsidiary organizations just have kind of perfect autonomy on their own and the state serves them. That's not the case. But it's also not the case that the state is this unity that can be articulated apart from them. For him, he thinks that the problem, there's this famous Benjamin Constant essay, liberty, the problem of liberty in the ancients and the moderns, something like that. The problem for Hegel is how you need to properly order these subsidiary relationships such that they're ordered to the good of the state, but without any kind of tension or contradiction. So there needs to be this kind of necessary harmony between the state and the civil society, but that requires both to be properly ordered to the other. And I think that again is the sort of thing that we discussed earlier, where it's like that just involves a faculty of judgment. There's not like a formula that you can get.
Yeah.
You have a constant negotiation between the state and civil society that needs to take place.
Yeah. Because you're talking there at the subsidiary organizations. It seems to me that the fundamental problem within a lot of the fascist movements is that ultimately the subsidiary organizations just became arms of the state rather than distinct subsidiary organizations. And so they weren't genuinely able to advocate for their members as a distinct body from the state considered as a whole.
Yeah, they don't. I think one reason why that's the case is because, Robert Nisbet wrote a lot about this, that fascist movements tend to appear and they tend to be successful and take power in countries that are kind of in social freefall. Like they've experienced some sort of implosion of pre-existing social organizations to organize people around private goods. And there's a kind of reassertion of the public will that then has to reconstruct these organizations through political fiat. And the problem then is that all these organizations are going to be subordinate to specific acts of political power. They're going to be kind of reconstructed by a central will rather than kind of organically reflecting the activities of civil society instead of growing organically out of that civil society. I think that's a genuine problem for fascist and totalitarian political projects. Yeah. That said, I think that's like highly circumstantial. It's like that's a product of fascism. I don't know if is really to blame for that. It's more fascist movements tend to emerge during these periods of social crisis where there's already a prior kind of slide into atomism.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
And fascist nowadays almost has no meaning. It's been removed from its original context under Mussolini's government at a particular time in history.
Yeah.
I think
that both in the present day, Paul Gottfried, the historian, and then mid-20th century Ernst Nolte, is a big influence on Gottfried. Their histories of fascism, at least my understanding of their thesis, is they think that fascism really can only be understood as a historically contingent phenomenon that emerged in the interwar period. And therefore, it basically has no content today. I would say I'm not certain that I'm committed to that kind of radically historicist interpretation of fascism, but I think that generally speaking, fascism can only be understood in a very peculiar political circumstance where you have this breakdown of a previous constitutional order. But that constitutional order doesn't just refer to, in the American sense, like the constitution of the government, but more like the Hegelian sense of the state, like, or the classical sense of a regime, where the order of social affairs of a society is broken down, and a fascist is kind of attempting to reassert through political fiat some kind of order. And I think that that's usually doomed to fail, but not because it's kind of ignoble to try to revive political order. More
yeah.
You're working with damaged materials.
Yeah. All right, so I do want to take some questions from the chat before we run out of time. I thought I'd do that for a little bit.
Sure.
And we can continue our discussion from this. So here we go. I got one from Twitter. Let me see if I can maybe screenshot it and then pull it up on the screen. Hold on. Let me see if I can do this. This one. Here we go. All right, yeah, let's see if I can just screen share this one particular. Hold on, or no. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, I got it. All right, so our question here is, I'm Irish. Ireland broke away from the UK when it was very religious. When it broke away from England, Ireland's Catholicism appeared very strong on the outside during the post-independence era and De Valera period. When the scandals came in the 1990s, Ireland's Catholicism collapsed. The Catholics in the part of England where England kept stay to this day quite strong and religious, while the South is destroyed with liberalism, which follows my question. Should Ireland stay loyal to England, a Protestant king? And is an act of rebellion illegitimately damage a nation's soul? The father of wrongful rebellion is Satan. Thus, Ireland is rebelling wrongfully, invited the devil into the seams of the newly woven state. I actually do. This is my Irish wife is going to get mad at me saying this, but I do think that there is some genuineness to the Northern Irish cause, which seems to be much better off today than the Southern Irish, than the most of Ireland, which has just basically become infected with liberalism. And it's quite interesting that the Northern Irish are the conservative ones today.
Yeah, I don't know enough about. I have been in Northern Ireland actually, and been to the rest of Ireland. Belfast I hope people aren't offended by this. It was not my favorite tourist destination. Whereas the rest of Ireland is quite beautiful. But yeah, I don't really know, because if you look at the people who settled in Northern Ireland, the Ulster Scots, they're also extremely conservative in the United States. The Ulster Scots are kind of the backbone of socially conservative Christian Southern Baptist politics in the U.S. There's problems with that, but they tend to be a conservative group, and that might be for social reasons. I know. I think Thomas Sowell has argued that the kind of like clannish family structures of this society of the Ulster Scots kind of produces a certain way of life that tends to be conservative in a lot of ways. So I don't know what's going on there. I don't think Ireland is being punished providentially for its rebellion. I think that the Irish Republic was quite based. Dave Valera and Michael Collins are heroes. I don't know enough.
That's
about
fair. Yeah,
and I do think also one last
initial.
thing.
Continue. Yeah.
Just one last thing I was going to say about the causes. Controversial take. I do think that the ethnic tensions in Northern Ireland probably produce a more conservative society, because I think that societies that are confronted with genuine like military threats and tensions tend to actually have to take seriously kind of the basic exigencies of politics. Whereas like Western Europe, a big reason why Western Europe is so like dysfunctional and kind of like myopically concerned with these like meaningless social issues. Not that they shouldn't concern us, like the various cultural progressive causes, but the reason why these animate huge chunks of the population is because these are kind of wealthy, decadent societies that don't have to consider the fundamental political questions of like national security. I think that results in the state being subordinated to the market, and the kind of values that go along with that are kind of progressive liberal attitudes. I think that's part of Ireland, kind of decay of Ireland into this neoliberal hellscape.
Yeah. And I think Ireland does show some of my concerns with what a lot of integralists want to revive, which is the confessional state. Because under Ireland's constitution, if I remember correctly, they have official laws about how natural law is the principle behind all other laws in Ireland, which ultimately actually does nothing in practice. That I think that the confessional state is fundamentally the modern state with a nice layer of Catholicism or natural law thrown on top of it. But rather than a more Catholic view, which is that you have to fundamentally change the structure of society. It can't simply be a change of names.
Yeah, I would agree. It's worth noting that even though Ireland's constitution, I suspect, would be more pleasing to many of us than the American Constitution in terms of church-state relations, that it did accord special privileges to the Catholic Church. The Pope at the time, who was Pope during the Irish Revolution, or in like 1922, is this Pius XI? I'm not sure.
That's probably likely, yeah.
He was disappointed by the Irish Constitution because it wasn't actually considered a confessional state by the Vatican, because it didn't accord the Church. It didn't make Catholicism the state religion, and it didn't accord the Church a proper independence in politics.
Yeah.
So I think there are constitutional problems with the Irish Constitution.
I'll stop sharing there. I'm going to bring up an example of what I think is actually a good modern confessional state, which was Dollfuß's Austria. I think Dollfuß did a really good job trying to actually bring about a revival of the Catholic order, where we're going to have distinct corporate groups of these sort of a modern guild structure that actually have some independence from the state and can actually operate. And he made sure to put the Concordat with the Vatican as a central element of the Constitution. It seems to me he's sort of been forgotten in history, but he should be probably remembered as one of the greatest 20th century political leaders.
Yeah, and I suppose arguably a martyr. As
Yeah,
someone who's some of my ancestors are from Dulphus's Austria, I'm a fan. So
yeah,
yeah, I think in Dulphus's Austria, I usually cite as kind of my ideal modern state. Many of my
yeah.
friends who are kind of more moderate integralists who don't want to ruffle as many feathers will cite Salazar. I don't know enough about
Uh,
Salazar.
there's a good
Um,
article, it's by some sort of more lefty Catholic guy, but it brings up some interesting critiques of Salazar, of how basically arguing that he was a little bit of an incompetent ruler in practice because he didn't actually bring about good results. But I think this goes back to our earlier discussion of prudence, that you can't just have good principles, you actually have to have prudence. And Dollfuss didn't last long enough to see if he had that prudence.
right? Yeah. If you find that article on Salazar, I'd be interested in taking a look
It,
at it.
it
What
it's in New Polity. It's from a guy who calls himself a left Catholic. So take it with some grains of salt, but it still is interesting. Here, I'll drop it in the chat right now if people want to see it.
Yeah, I'd be interested in taking a look at that. I would also just say, as an offhand comment, someone who might be worth checking out for readers, who is a writer in Dulphus's Austria. He's a philosopher and economist who kind of combines Hegelian and Thomistic theories of the state. And he's an Austrian Catholic, is Ottmar Spahn. People might be interested in reading Ottmar Spahn.
Yeah. I was gonna say, yeah. I also think the other concern with Salazar that is brought up sometimes is under Pope Paul VI. He was suppressing papal encyclicals and such, but you also kind of can't blame him because Paul VI was actively working to undermine the confessional states. He was actively trying to take apart Salazar's Portugal and was siding with the communists in Salazar's Portugal. So I have a lot of sympathy towards Salazar just ending up suppressing some of those papal encyclicals attacking this.
Yeah, I have a good friend who will blame Paul VI and Dignitatis Humanae for undermining
Yeah,
Francoist
because
Spain. Um,
I do agree with the sort of esoteric reading of Dignitatis Humanae laid out by Thomas Pink as the correct interpretation of it. But I think the way in which the document is worded leads to the actual principles, which I think the people writing it were mostly trying to do, which is to undermine the traditional order. And even Thomas Pink mostly concedes this. He thinks that the principles behind the document are still problematic, even if it's not heretical.
I thought his claim was that if you dig into the relatios of the document, it's basically orthodox, but was worded ambiguously in a way that like lent itself to
yeah, and he thinks that there was a genuine shift in the actual practical policy of the church.
Right.
So he's interestingly said a number of times that he disagrees with the SSPX on their interpretation of it because they would adopt the same interpretation as the liberals, but they would say then it's heretical. But he probably agrees with them a lot more on the actual practice of how it should be implemented.
Yeah, there was a critique of Thomas Pink. So I've read him on the document. There was a critique of him that came out within the last year that I've been meaning to give a look to, but I haven't.
Yeah.
Seen. He's also been criticized heavily by liberals.
Yeah, but I think the problem is if the liberals are right, then either the SSPX or the Sedevacantists are right. Then
I'm very sympathetic to the SSPX.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. All right. Next comment I want to bring up. There was a number of related questions. We got one about Occam's political philosophy. I don't know that much about Occam himself, but then we got a question about Occam's nominalism leading to the destruction of society, and then that Luther liked Occam. So I first want to respond to this. Luther actually did not like Occam. Luther says he's a Platonist in his writings. Now, I think there is a good case that Luther's principles behind his theory of justification is nominalist. I do think that's the case, but I don't think Luther was intending it to be nominalist. And I don't think that Luther himself is intending to be a nominalist. There's other spots where Luther is quite Aristotelian and other spots where he's quite Platonic. So I just think Luther's a bad philosopher. And as to whether I think nominalism led to some major changes in society, but I don't think nominalism can be summed up in Occam coming up with some new ideas. These are rooted within pre-existing debates within the Middle Ages. And also Occam wasn't even a nominalist, he was a conceptualist. So Occam thinks that universals do really exist, it's just that they only exist within our minds. Now that is a significant shift, but he's still working within the same general framework versus someone like Descartes, who's much more radical in breaking apart the traditional order, even if probably Descartes might get more right conclusions than Occam, if that makes sense.
Right.
I don't know if
Yeah,
you disagree at all there.
I have to say, so I'm not at all an expert on Occam's political thought. I understand that he's oftentimes construed by contemporary writers on the history of political philosophy as though he were some kind of early social contract theorist and like a proto-liberal. I'm extremely skeptical of that.
Yeah, I
mean, people say the same thing about like Marsilius of Padua. They say
Yeah,
this about Nicholas Cusanus, which is just straightforwardly
yeah,
false.
I think that this is because a lot of these political philosophers only know modern political philosophy. They've read Filmer probably once, and they think Filmer is articulating the traditional view. And so if Occam doesn't sound like Filmer, then he must be articulating a modern view.
Yeah, they see people like Occam and Cusanus and others, and even Aquinas talk about consent of the people, and they use terms like that. And they just assume that this is William of Ockham and John Locke are saying the same thing. They're clearly not. They think, and like if you look at I know more about Cusanus on this question. He thinks that consent has to be articulated in terms of these prior representative bodies, and he has a very complex theory of representation.
Yeah, and this is basically
reading.
Yeah, this is basically everyone in the Scholastic period. When we were discussing earlier, Scotus sounds kind of like this at points. Even Aristotle in the beginning of the Politics could sound like that. If you read the first few chapters of the Politics and stopped there, you could probably construe him as some sort of contract theorist.
Right. Yeah. So I don't have a strong view of Occam's political philosophy, but I am inclined to think that almost all political philosophers who are not medievalists who write on him are probably writing DS. I also think I used to actually adhere to this thesis that nominalism is the origin of like the destruction of Western civilization. This kind of Richard Weaver line, and I'm more skeptical of kind of like grand narratives of civilization
So am I.
that attribute it to some intellectual mistake, catastrophic error. Like, I mean, I think this is a common tendency of 20th century American conservatism. You have these decline and fall narrative, especially Catholic conservatives. You have this decline and fall narrative from the heights of Aquinas, and I mean, your good friend John Milbank will say it's Scotus who ruined everything. Richard Weaver says it's Occam. Other people say it's Descartes or Kant, or Nietzsche is a late one.
Yeah,
and I'm skeptical of these accounts. On the other hand, I maybe this is because I don't specialize in modern metaphysics and certainly not medieval metaphysics, but I find nominalism incoherent, and I don't understand how nominalists explain the possibility of science. I'm deeply confused by kind of straightforwardly nominalist readings of Occam. Maybe Occam himself has a more tenable view.
Well, it seems like I've read about this only in secondary literature, but from what I've heard, young Occam is much more nominalist, and later Occam is more of a conceptualist, where he basically thinks that there's not some universal hiding out in the things we can find. It's that our mind apprehends the similarities in things and creates universal concepts. And these are genuinely universal concepts. It's just that it's not, he's trying to get away from a Platonic conception and get to maybe a anti-Platonic Aristotle, the most anti-Platonic reading of Aristotle you could possibly get to, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I guess again, I'm not an expert in this. My problem is that it just seems like nominalists are unable to answer the kind of it seems like an epistemological theory. It's not able to answer kind of the metaphysical question of like what are the causes of
and a good chunk of these debates within Scotus too, and this is what Milbank misses, a good chunk of these debates are within treatises on the 10 categories of Aristotle and logic, and very few of them slip over into actual discussions of metaphysics. And so most of them are questions about how we predicate things and not so much about logic, and not so much about actual metaphysics of reality.
Sure.
I don't know if this is the case with Occam, but I know within Scotus, the things that people are troubled by almost always appear within these discussions of logic, and he's concerned that analogy is not a genuine way to predicate within logic because it violates the principle of non-contradiction.
That makes sense. I guess my problem is more with like modern nominalists, and I think they fall into a myth of the given problem, where they presuppose the reality that we are encountering is not already conceptual in some way. That seems to be a metaphysical and epistemological incoherence.
Yeah, I think if there was a spot people wanted to focus more on Occam being the beginning of modern political philosophy, it would be his actual politics, that he sided against the Pope on the debates about private property and basically defended the role of the state being the sole decider of private property, and that the church does not have any say on temporal matters.
Was
because he was involved. What?
Oh, sorry, I was going to ask. Was he excommunicated when he died for like
No,
being in Avignon or something?
No, he was never excommunicated. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
he was actually, even though there's a lot of disagreement with him, he always came up in a generally positive light within later scholastic treatises. Even if they disagreed with him, they saw him as another Catholic who got things wrong, rather than as the modern narrative of he's completely evil.
Oh, but I had thought that he was excommunicated, but not for heresy, for some kind of like court intrigue in Avignon. Like
maybe he was. He
I
might have been. Yeah,
like he was ordered not to leave Avignon when he was in the court of the Pope there, and fled intrigue and got excommunicated.
Yeah, I think the decisive shift has already happened at this point, which I think is more with Philip the Fair. That Philip the Fair refuses the political authority of the Pope. And I think this, if you want to shift to modernity, I think this is much more where the Pope where a civil ruler for the first time in hundreds of years wins a fight with the Pope and gets his way. That the church, that now the state can tax the churches.
Interesting.
And he moves the papacy to Avignon to ensure the papacy can't interfere with him anymore. Because if you look within, for example, Eastern Christianity, there's generally a subordination of the religious to the political. So, for example, Peter the Great simply removed the Patriarch of Moscow as a position, so there'd be no one to challenge him. And I think that the advantage the papacy has for politics is that the papacy provides a space outside of the temporal order. And now the liberals are going to use this to separate the two, but the Catholic view is then he directs the temporal order. The problem is the ordering of the two is incorrect. And I think ultimately one of them has to triumph within the real world. And I think that if you're going to have a shift, Boniface VIII losing after he publishes Unum Sanctum, the actual practice of what was happening is much more of a shift.
Right. And this is also a key justification of the Papal States itself, that even integralists who believe that ecclesiastical authority should not kind of establish distinctive states ordinarily, and should not intervene in the day-to-day administration of political affairs. They think that the Papal States exist to secure the independence of the power of the Pope.
Yeah. Some more questions. We got a number of questions about fascism. We already kind of addressed fascism. If it's really more complex than is easily laid out. That went on for quite a while. Someone asked about my series on Genesis. Yes, I do plan to continue that at some point. Somebody asked about your username. Is it from the famous Father Joseph Kleutgen?
Yeah.
More questions about fascism. Somebody brought up the Beatific Vision. I'm not convinced that there is a substantive difference between Catholics and Orthodox on this, because there was internal disputes among Catholics on this. So within the Franciscan tradition, there was an emphasis on the union of God through an act of love and an act of will, versus the Thomistic account of the union of God through the act of intellection. It isn't so much political, but I do think that these debates are a lot more complex. The people oversimplify what the Catholics believe, and they oversimplify what the Orthodox believe, and then draw a dichotomy between the two. And I don't think that that's fair.
Yeah, in my limited knowledge, I'm not sure that there's a substantive difference.
Yeah. All right. The question of what do we think is the best form of government and why? For me, I think you need that decentralization of a feudal model, but I don't think that one is best or another. I think if you have the perfect monarch, that's the best. But I think in practice, the wisdom of a mix of monarchy, aristocracy, and polity is necessary. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I tend to follow Hegel on this, and he's a defender of national, representative, and constitutional monarchy. I think that a hereditary monarchy, where the monarch has distinct powers which are not strictly legislative or executive, I think is the most eminently rational form of government. Hegel gives very complex arguments for that, but I think that obviously it depends on the circumstances, but in principle, this is the best form of government.
Yeah, I think the people who want to simply sort of cite St. Thomas as an absolute monarchist are missing the next line where he thinks if you have a bad king, this is the worst form of government possible. And that for St. Thomas, basically, the better the form of government you have, the worse it gets if you have bad rulers, because it has more power.
Right. There are a lot of commentators who will either interpret him as an absolute monarchist, but there are also a lot who will interpret him as laying out basically something like a 19th century constitutional monarchy. Now, that probably is a little bit
No,
anachronistic. I think that Aquinas does think that the best form of government is some kind of mixed monarchical regime.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I would say a mixed monarchical regime is probably best too, simply in reality.
Right. Yeah, that would be what I would defend as well. I think one thing that's interesting to consider, I had a tweet about this a long time ago, is like, it's a common argument I hear among trads. The best form of government has to be absolute because God rules as an absolute monarch.
Mhm.
And the natural political realm should mirror the kingdom of heaven somehow. I think this is kind of odd because again, there's this distinction between the finite personality of human beings and the infinite personality of God. That in a certain sense, God is a constitutional monarch, but he is his own constitution.
Yeah,
Because God is supreme reason. But in human beings who are not supremely rational, who are not necessarily bound to the moral law, because they can deviate from it, is what I mean. They don't necessarily execute the moral law unfailingly. There's a distinction between the constitution of the state and the personality of the monarch. So that seems like a key distinction that has to be taken into account. And it's a reason why we can't conceive of God simply as an absolute monarch on the model of a capricious human despot. So I think that actually kind of counts in favor of the view that a constitutional monarchy imitates God's divine government.
yeah, and it's not like God then rules in the world to come as an absolute monarch. He desires the saints to ask for what they want. Right? If God wanted to rule as an absolute monarch in which we got no say, we wouldn't have any prayer. God desires that we ask certain things, right? And for example, we see in scripture that God, for example, goes to Abraham and asks Abraham to counsel him. Well, obviously, God doesn't actually need anyone to counsel him, but God has created intelligent beings because he desires intelligent beings to play a role within the created order.
Right. Yeah. The relevant difference or the relevant similarity between God and kind of human absolute monarch is that they both rule without any external limitation imposed on them, at least in respect of their rule. But
Yeah.
the dissimilarity is that in God's case, his rule it is regulated by law that he imposes on himself. Uh, so that's not the case of a human absolute monarch.
Yeah. All right. Go on to some more here then. More questions about fascism, but I think we already addressed those concerns. The question about the founding of America. And before actually we do that, another one came up about the Beatific Vision. So I think that within this, there's simply a lot of equivocation of what people mean by essence and activities and energies and so on. So I could do a whole nother video addressing that, but I won't go into that so much right now. And go back to the founding of America, because I think you've brought up some really interesting points that the founders can't simply be reduced to liberals. Because there's sort of two narratives among Catholics in America. Either the Catholics were entirely just liberals and destroyed America, or actually Thomas Jefferson was a crypto-Bellarmine scholar who reframed Bellarmine using Lockean terms, but actually Bellarmine was a libertarian, and so that's why we should all be libertarians now. And I think that both of those narratives are oversimplifying things. I mean, at least the first narrative actually makes coherent sense. The second one doesn't. But I think both narratives are significantly oversimplifying things. And you've brought up some interesting points in the past about the founding fathers possibly being classified more as classical Republicans than simply liberals.
Yeah. So who's the guy who writes that? Bellarmine and Locke are basically saying the same thing. It's Thomas Gordon or Tim Gordon.
Tim Gordon, yeah. But he hasn't come up with that. That existed before him.
Yeah, I mean, there are all these kinds of copes that American Catholics come up with. Like George Washington had a deathbed conversion to Catholicism. This is a popular 19th century fantasy. Orestes Brownson propagates this myth. This isn't true. The claim that Washington had a deathbed conversion, it's like, well, a Jesuit priest came over from the nearby church to convert him and administer last rites. Well, that church actually wasn't constructed until the Jesuit mission wasn't constructed until after Washington's death. So the myth develops much later. I think a lot of the reason why people believe this is they don't want to be unpatriotic. They don't want to believe that they live in a country that destroyed the world. which, I mean, I don't think that the founders' vision is quite as demonic as it gets characterized. But they recognize that less than 1% of Americans at the time of the founding were Catholic. It's a Protestant country historically. So they come up with these narratives to try to fit in and to feel like they belong, which isn't totally unreasonable, but they kind of do violence to the history. I think if you look at the writings of the founders, so I posted a long time ago on Twitter just like a record of citations during the founding period, which various figures were cited by popular authors as well as the founding fathers the most. It's not John Locke. John Locke is briefly cited, I think, heavily in the 1760s and the early 1770s to justify the right to revolution. But he's never cited, or very rarely cited, in questions of constitutional design. That during the Constitutional Convention, they cite Blackstone and Montesquieu heavily.
Yeah.
And then also in terms of ancient writers, they cite like Aristotle and Cicero and Polybius.
Yep. Well, they're also reading Tacitus and Livy quite a bit, who are giving examples of an actual lived republic within practice, I think. And I think those are important.
Yeah. I think they're much more influenced by the historical record and by philosophers of classical antiquity. And Montesquieu is largely a commentator on philosophers of classical antiquity, not by these radical liberal visions, which even so, modern 21st century liberalism did not exist even in the most radical of the 18th century philosophers. So I think this demonic vision is inaccurate. Also, the founders really can't be understood apart from the history of Calvinist republicanism in the 17th century England.
Who is it we were talking about over messages recently? Trying to remember his Althusius.
Oh yeah, Johannes Althusius.
Yeah, because Althusius comes up here, and I think Althusius is actually very, very indebted to the classical tradition, or someone you want to revive, who's one of these writers. I think Althusius does a lot of good there. I'd like to read him myself. I've just heard about him, but it seems like he is going in a better direction here.
Yeah, I'm not sure enough about his direct influence on the American founding, but he is oftentimes cited as a thinker of subsidiarity who was influenced by the scholastics. And a lot of modern Catholic writers, although Althusius, I believe, was a Dutch reformed of some kind. I don't think he was Catholic. I always get him confused with Justus Lipsius, who is a Belgian Catholic apologist, but who's in the same period, I think. But Althusius was a lot of modern Catholic conservatives will cite him, especially in the European Union when it comes to subsidiarity debates.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of good. There's a general natural law Christian tradition within Europe of subsidiarity discussions going on. And I want to bring this up in a comment that I just saw here of America rebelled against monarchy, ergo it is evil. That I think that this view that monarchy is good and any sort of voting is bad is a fundamentally modern view that is not actually held by the medievals. That yes, if they weren't liberals, but I think that this sort of view of we need an absolute monarchy and no other form of government is licit is a view that comes up in Filmer that's fundamentally modern. That's what the historiography ends up reading into the Middle Ages. But I think we can see from our earlier discussion that that's not the primary thing the medievals were concerned with. They were concerned with lots of other questions and sort of threw government up, whether we should have one leader, two leaders, or elect our leader, up to a question of prudence more than philosophy.
Yeah, my understanding is that the precise kind of electoral systems that we have today are kind of uniquely modern, but the idea of representative institutions is not at all a modern phenomenon. It goes back to ancient Greece and also to the Western European tradition, the early Middle Ages. I would say that if you were a Catholic at the time of the American Revolutionary War, it would make sense to side with the Loyalists, not because the American revolutionaries were anti-monarchist, but because they did have kind of like populist anti-Catholic resentment. But that's for entirely contingent reasons. That's not because of the question of monarchy. Yeah,
and I think that this question of unchecked universal democracy, I think that, I hold views that voting needs to be heavily restricted, but I think the primary concern is not so much who is voting, of getting back to an actual classical view of politics, which I think is a lot more complex than sort of the Twitter debates over how many people are ruling, which ultimately still keeps the same fundamental structure.
Right. I think that underlying a lot of these debates is the assumption that is effectively liberal, that you can have some kind of like watchmaker constitution, like you wind up the constitution and then it's self-regulating,
Yeah,
and it can kind of operate mechanically without human intervention. Whether
yeah,
that's like this kind of, I'm not saying his work is without value, but this kind of like Hans Hermann Hoppe view of private law monarchy, or certain kind of liberal views of self-regulating democracies. That's not true. You need a very complex social order in order to have a stable
yeah,
society, and that
yeah.
social order needs to cultivate virtue on the part of
Yeah,
citizens.
'cause I want to respond here to Frederick's point about the fall of the Roman Empire, because I have actually read quite a bit of the writings from this time. So I majored in classics, and I think Cicero is really the main writer who needs to be read from this time period. But Saint Augustine continually cites Cicero very positively, and Cicero was very critical of the fall into this he didn't call it monarchy, he called it tyranny that was happening, and argued that actually it was the Roman Republic that preserved proper monarchy through the rule of two consuls who would play the role of dual monarchs, who he argued though were still elected by the people. And St. Augustine is very positive towards De Republica by Cicero. He thinks the one thing that Cicero misses is that the state then needs to be ordered towards a supernatural good of God, and that Cicero misses the supernatural good of God. But he actually argues this using Cicero's own arguments of taking up Cicero's argument that a republic has to have proper justice. And this is the point, is it has to have proper justice, which means it has to give to each person what is their due. And Augustine argues that the Roman Republic did not give its proper due to God, and therefore it wasn't a true republic. Just like Cicero argued, the republic in his day had failed to be a true republic because it wasn't giving justice anymore. And I think that that's much more the underlying issue than how many people are voting.
And this is in City of God.
This is in City of God. He takes up Cicero's arguments from De Republica. Yeah, it's right at the beginning of the work and then right at the end again. So it's sort of bookending Augustine's whole discussion. And Cicero here is really trying to summarize both Plato and Aristotle and apply them to the issues going on in his day of the fall of the Roman Republic. Because a lot of trads sort of like to glorify Caesar and stuff. And I think Caesar was a pretty horrible person who undermined the well-functioning Roman government from beforehand.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm not. I might be one of these populist types who sympathizes with Caesar, but I'm not a classicist, so I don't actually.
That's fair. And to be fair, since I have worked in classics, you end up. I think classicists are very divided on how to view Caesar, because we want to have both Caesar and Cicero be heroes, even though they hated each other.
Right.
And so they were both classical writers, and so we have to pretend like they were liked each other, even though we've read plenty of them to know they hated each other.
Yeah, I suspect also for those of us who are not classicists, we're not really paying attention to the kind of concrete political question. It's more the kind of romanticized image of what does Caesar come to represent.
Yeah.
So in the Catholic tradition, a lot of us are reading about Caesar through like Dante, right?
Yeah. And I also don't think the later Roman Empire was as strictly absolutist as people would like it to be. If you read in Tacitus, other people are doing quite a bit, and so the emperors are constantly having to try and intervene. And this is right from the very beginning. Someone mentioned Sulla broke it down more. I agree, Sulla broke things down more, but I don't think Caesar was this great hero who's trying to fix everything up. I think he was heavily an opportunist. All right, that's all the questions we got from everyone here. I don't know if you had any last comments you wanted to make about our discussion, or anything else you wanted to bring up.
No, I thought this was a really interesting discussion. Yeah, I really.
This was, yeah.
So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and there's so many little things we could possibly discuss. So maybe we could do another one. But I think this was really good, and thank you everyone for watching and the questions.
Yeah. Oh, somebody did say Elijah Hallberg said it. Gordon and Ryan Grant had a good debate on the founding of America. I would recommend that debate.
Yeah, I would too, and I'd also recommend Ryan Grant just recently published an article on this too, where he's going back and actually walking through and showing how very clearly none of the founders have read Bellarmine.
Yeah, I think Ryan Grant is another Twitter account, and all of his YouTube videos is just like consistently excellent on like history.
Yeah.
So-
He and I have been talking about getting him on here to discuss the claim that the founders read Bellarmine, but his article, I think, just does a good job of summing it up.
Yeah, he goes through in the debate with Timothy Gordon.
Yeah.
Pretty decisive.
Yeah.
It'd be cool to if you have him on. I'll definitely listen.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for watching, and have a good day.